Hi boys. I want to explain how you go about evaluating the approaches. So this is required in your research task and it's really tricky. That's why it's for excellence. All right, it's not going to be easy. So you have to comprehensively examine different approaches used to explain, in this case, attraction. Okay, and comprehensively means looking at strengths and limitations. Now, you don't need to worry about strengths because the strength of any explanation in psychology is in the quality of the evidence. And you've already talked about supporting studies in your research paper. I want you to focus on the weaknesses. So you give one or two weaknesses per approach. Now, you can look at the weakness in your explanation, your argument, or the weakness in the supporting studies. And so remember, you've given reasons why, your two people were attracted to each other, how they fell in love, and a supporting study. Now you have to go and pick holes in it. Is that explanation legit? Is there something wrong with the study? Do you trust the studies? Is there some reason why you think, well, actually that study kind of has a problem if I use it to support this particular argument? Are there some holes in your logic? Maybe there are some other explanations which are better, or maybe there are some other factors involved that it's not just as simple as, A equals B. Now, this is really tricky, but I want you to go back and reread your explanations and your evidence and go, man, but do I really trust them? Are they actually that good, right? So you can look for additional explanations, so things like the interactions between the approaches. Is it just sex hormones, or do we know where the hormones could have come from, or is it issues with cultural dimensions, and how do we measure that, and isn't that just stereotyping? You could find some contradictory evidence. You could say, well, actually, here's a study that shows that pheromones don't influence human behavior. So that's a big limitation if you can find a study that contradicts what you've already said in your paper. That involves doing a bit of extra research. I put here that's hard, but actually that might be an easier one. You could look at limitations in the studies, like I've said. So, you could say, is you're using the evolutionary approach to explain behavior, but maybe there's another factor. For example, if we do aggression, we could say, well, testosterone, but we also know culture of honor can change aggression. Are there some additional factors that might be influencing behavior? If we think about aggression as an example, maybe it's the brain, but what changes the brain? What changes our hormones? What can influence our thinking? Or is the brain, or is our biology affecting our behavior because it's having some other influence on some other variable? Okay, now you can see this is really challenging. It's pretty tricky. And like I said, if you want to find some contradictory evidence, you might have to do some additional research. So can you find some evidence that says there are no human pheromones, or that cultural dimensions don't influence behavior, or that modern women aren't more interested in a man that is high status? You could think about, I think these particular prompts may be not so relevant for you, but are there limitations in some of the studies? Were they animal studies? Can we apply that to humans? Do they have small sample sizes? There's a blog post here that could help you evaluate that. But the key thing is, I want you to be looking at your specific explanations and not give me vague, generalized responses, okay? Now, I could type this into ChatGPT and say, what's the limitation with my explanation for why the Nazis killed the Jews out of conformity? Now, I come up with some really impressive looking answers from ChatGPT that I might be tempted to use. However, I will warn against you doing this for two reasons. One, you will be asked about your research paper, and I might be picking out some random boys and asking them questions, and I might say, hey, what was one limitation of your evolutionary approach? Now, if you can't tell me what your limitation was because you copied and pasted it and you never really remembered it or understood it, you run the risk of getting a not achieved for academic dishonesty for your whole paper. If you've really carefully thought about the limitations for explanations, you'll have no problem summarizing it after a day or two of submitting it and telling me, oh yeah, well, I said that it was because of XYZ, but the limitation I said was because of ABC. So that's one reason. The other reason is a lot of these aren't actually evaluating the particular argument themselves, and they're not really based on psychology. So I would be very careful about using ChatGPT answers for this. And we did these exercises in class, right? So if I said my evolutionary explanation for why the Nazis conformed and murdered Jews because they didn't want to be kicked out of the group, and that's why they instinctively conformed with what everyone else was doing. Now, like I say, a problem with that, and one of the problems that some of you identified in class was that, but that type of conformity, not wanting to be kicked out of the group, maybe you have to explain some minor things like why we might change our attitudes, or maybe how we might dress differently to fit in, or maybe why we might keep quiet. But in order to murder someone, we've really got to override our inherent morality. And that's asking a lot of us, right? And so I think that's a bit of a far-fetched to say, well, they didn't want to be kicked out of the group, therefore they killed someone. We could have said, they were on meth and that influences their oxytocin levels. That could have made them numb to their crimes and increased their out-group bias and out-group hatred. Although we could have also said, well, actually, we know that oxytocin is to do with bonding and attention and affection. So perhaps, potentially, that might not work because the oxytocin could have been making them kinder towards other people or more empathetic. So maybe that's a limitation with this explanation. The socio-cultural approach, we can say, that maybe they were just complying because the leaders of the Nazi Party were wearing symbols of authority. But a limitation with this explanation is that, one of the study here was saying people conformed or complied with the request from someone wearing a uniform when they told them to pick up rubbish. But again, we're making a very big leap to someone putting in rubbish, which is a pro-social behavior, which is a positive behavior, to therefore then saying, well, that's why they murdered people, which is a very antisocial, a very horrible, immoral behavior. So there's a logical fallacy here. This is a false analogy of saying picking up trash and murdering someone. So that would be a limitation in this explanation. You see, this stuff is not easy. And so a lot of you're not going to be able to do this with the first thought that comes to your head. You're going to need to think really carefully about it. All right, good luck.